and I see a lot of people coming and a lot of familiar faces. So welcome, and I'm also happy that we can listen to the very interesting lecture of Mr. Kevin McNamara, and I'm really looking forward to it. So I would like to give the floor to Kevin.
Hi, good afternoon. Glad everyone could make it out today despite all the traffic challenges that you experienced, even including our speaker too. So, first of all, I would like to thank Ambassador Kmetz and the Slovak Embassy for allowing us to host this event here. It's really appreciated. And I'll go into, I'll give you a little intro about Mr. McNamara. Kevin McNamara is an associate scholar at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and is a former contributing editor to its quarterly journal, Orvis. In researching the book he's going to talk about today, he followed the path of the Czech-Slovak Legion after the fall of the Russian Tsar and acquired first-hand accounts that formed the basis of his very engaging book. So with that, let's give a big warm welcome to Kevin McNamara.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming out on a terrific Saturday. There has to be better things you could do, but maybe not. I'm kind of flattered. I have some prepared remarks. I hope to inform you about this story. I think a lot of you probably know at least the outlines of it, but the book is a lot more informative, of course. But I also want to encourage you to have questions for me after this. I'd like to talk about the things that you are interested in the story. The story is rather, I hate the word complex because it discourages people from reading it. I say it's intricate. It's an intricate story. A lot of players, it's global. Not many people know that Tomáš Masaryk first learned that he would be president of Czechoslovakia while he was sitting down to dinner in Philadelphia, my city where I live. He was sitting down to dinner at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, which is still standing. It's called the Bellevue, I think now. And sitting down for dinner, and someone handed him a telegram. And his colleagues back in Prague, who had formed a revolutionary government, just voted sort of by acclamation that he'd be president, and someone else would be prime minister. So there's a local angle for me as well. An educated person today might be forgiven for thinking, like the author of the book of Ecclesiastes, in the Bible, that, quote, there is nothing new under the sun, at least when it comes to history. People might think, hasn't every fact been unearthed, every story told? And that might be true, but historical episodes can find themselves kind of lost, ignored, overlooked, and forgotten. And that is the case with the story of this book, whose 100th anniversary is approaching. Lost between the lines of the multiple histories of a tumultuous time, it begins as the final horrors of the First World War melted into the growing chaos in the east of the Russian Revolution. The fate of 4 empires hung in the balance. The United States and its allies bungled a half-hearted attempt to reverse the course of Russian history. The Soviet Union was born, a fragile peace declared, and the map of Europe was redrawn. This episode combines, the story that's told in my book combines historic achievement on one hand. The men and their leaders actually accomplished what they set out to do. With epic misadventure, on the other hand, almost everything about their adventure, their epic story, was a series of errors and accidents that no one could have predicted. But one of the values of the story, see, if I was a Kurd sitting in the Middle East thinking, how do I create my country? There are still people who want to create their countries at this late date. I might read this book because the roadmap isn't quite for everybody. Especially the part about all the fighting in Siberia. But it does demonstrate how an entire country can be created from whole cloth amidst the chaos of war and revolution by a rather small number of determined individuals. In an age when many peoples across the globe still yearn to create their own nation states, despite strongly negative views of nationalism, articulated by elites on the right and the left, this can be an illuminating tale about how a small number of Czechs and Slovaks used exile, treason, espionage, propaganda, lobbying, fundraising, and diplomacy to destroy the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a dynasty hundreds of years old, the Habsburgs, and created in its stead the many small nations that still today influence Europe's future. And the episode also illuminates a few buried truths about the creation of the Soviet Union. Mistruths that still circulate today, unfortunately. The story itself veers wildly back and forth between the unlikely, on the one hand, and the improbable, which is what drew me to this story many, many years ago. I worked on this for 23 years after that trip to Siberia. And I stuck with it because it just seemed like such an amazing story that I just stuck with it. Not one person intended for the events of this story to happen. That's clear. Nobody. Not one person involved expected or anticipated or desired that these events take place. No one could have imagined that they would happen. Indeed, the other value of this episode is that it's a cautionary tale. You could say that at the very end it ended well for the Czechs and Slovaks, kind of emotionally. But it should be read by political and military leaders to give them pause the next time they feel an urge to unleash the dogs of war. No one with any confidence can predict what will follow. Many years ago when I started on this project, I asked myself, how could all this have actually taken place? But later, about a year ago, as I put the finishing touches on the book, I began to ask myself another question. How did we come to forget this story? I mean, how is that possible? And so what is it that we forgot? We forgot the story of an undistinguished array of shopkeepers, dentists, farmers, professors, factory hands, bank clerks, a cross-section of middle-class men plucked from the obscurity of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the heart of Europe and plunged into the First World War. They fought on the Eastern Front, and for Americans, that's like the far side of the moon. Winston Churchill called the Eastern Front the Unknown War. That was actually the title of one of his books about World War I, The Unknown War. That was the Eastern Front, where more than 2 million Austro-Hungarian soldiers were taken prisoner by Tsarist Russian armies. So the Tsar is still in power up until 1917. And by 1917, there were 2 million, a little over 2 million Austro-Hungarian soldiers in POW camps, about 300 of them, across European Russia and Siberia, and down into what is now Kazakhstan and other places. When Russia itself collapses, when the Tsar, when his regime collapses amidst the revolution and chaos, an elderly fugitive professor from Prague, Tomas Masaryk, traveled to Russia with a vision. And as I get older, I'm impressed with the fact that in 1917, Masaryk is 67 years old. And 100 years ago, close to, more like 77 today, 87 maybe. He's pretty old to be running around the world without a job or too many friends, or he's living out of a suitcase, he's begging money. He's a remarkable man. So he travels to Russia. He knows one of the leaders of the provisional government in Russia. And Americans just confuse all this. They just think Lenin showed up one day and everything changed, and then it was communism. But there was a provisional government in Russia from February or March through October or November. It was completely inept, as inept as the Tsar's regime. But the people were well-meaning. They were small d Democrats. They were liberals. They believed in democracy. But after that, they didn't have a clue as to what they should do. They should have withdrawn from the war, but they didn't. But Masaryk has a friend in that government. He goes to Russia. Arriving in Russia, he negotiates a deal with this guy who was nominally the #2, but really the #1 in the Russian government. But he also meets a French diplomat diplomat in Russia, and very quickly promises the French, I think he promised them at the time, 30,000 men. Now, at the time, in 1917, the French and the British are still taking a beating on the Western Front. They definitely could have lost that war more than once. In fact, they could have lost it right until the summer of 1918, when the American troops start showing up very late in the game, but in very high numbers. But in 1917, they could have still lost the war. The bloodshed was just incredible. So when Masaryk approached the French and said, I have 30,000 soldiers, they were experienced soldiers, even though they were in POW camps, he just said, I just need to get them to the Western Front. And immediately the French said yes. And the French ended up paying for and subsidizing the Czech-Slovak Legion initially. So Masaryk had about a year, a little bit less than a year in Russia, to try to go to the camps. He himself had to go to the camps, the POW camps, where there were somewhere between 210 and 250,000 Czechs and Slovaks among the 2 million Austro-Hungarians. So Masaryk just went from camp to camp, and from trains where they were sometimes packed into trains sitting on rail inside their sidings, and just make his pitch. He just kept making a pitch, telling these guys, if you follow me, we might get our own country. It probably seemed audacious and ridiculous at the time. But then again, these guys were stuck in Russia, they were stuck in Siberia, and they didn't see any way home. This war could have just kept going on and on and on, and who knows what would have happened to them. But the plan was, of course, they would create their own little ad hoc army, which would be a unit of the French army. They would cross Siberia to Vladivostok, wherever that was. They would board ships, circle the globe, land in France, fight for the Allies on the Western Front. A lot of them would have to think they were going to die. And all this to gain for themselves independence from their unloved homeland, Austria-Hungary. I think it's remarkable that given the risks associated with such treason, the promise of a return to harsh combat, and the very blue sky ambitions of all this, I think it's remarkable that between 50 and 65,000 of the men said, we. This army came to be known as the Czecho-Slovak Legion. The men came to be known as legionnaires. That was a word that was kind of applied to them later. I think people saw French and then foreign soldier and made that connection, the French Foreign Legion, and I think it's a product of newspaper writers. They all called themselves brother. Everyone looked at the other and said brother, regardless of rank. It was brother this and brother that. But the men were now committing treason, and they killed people for that back in the day. And back in Austria, in Vienna, there was an army of clerks trying to keep track of what was going on with the POWs in Russia and other places, like reading your mail. So they could find out about this. And if it didn't turn out and you ended up going back to Austria-Hungary, you could seriously be executed or hung. That was a very real possibility. It happened. So the men are committing treason. But it's worse than that, really. They had no nation they could call home. They had no recognized or experienced military leaders, none. They had no evident means of support. Masaryk was trying to negotiate a loan from the French, but they had few supplies, ad hoc organization, uncertain legal status, questionable loyalties, and too few weapons. Many were still nursing wounds from the war or illness. Yet with the explicit approval of Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, and their colleagues, that's important, with their approval, the Legion commenced its journey across Siberia. And at the beginning of the story, most of them massed in the area of what we now call Ukraine. So they have to go from Ukraine to the Pacific Ocean. In their journey across Siberia, they had an unexpected encounter with history. The key event at the center of this story, it takes place with all the dignity of a barroom brawl. It had to have happened at some point. But a brief but furious altercation on May 14th, 1918, leaves two men lying dead on a train platform at the sleepy railroad station outside the Russian frontier town of Chelyabinsk, which is the western terminus of the Trans-Siberian. As you take the Trans-Siberian out of Moscow or St. Petersburg, you might not notice, but Chelyabinsk is the first city you would come to if you're going from west to east. Chelyabinsk is the first city you would come to after the Ural Mountains, which are not all that big a mountain range, but that's the beginning of Siberia. And it just happened to be at Chelyabinsk where this fight breaks out. And this is where a still loyal Hungarian soldier who's in a train, you can picture this, he's going that way. He's going back. He's being repatriated back to Austria-Hungary, back to the war, back home. And the train on the other side of the station is sitting this way. And these guys look familiar, these Czechs and Slovaks. A lot of them have a very familiar looking uniform. It's the same uniform he's wearing. They're going east to Vladivostok. And the train stopped, as they often did during the war, during the revolution, just like today, like Amtrak did. They stopped. And so the men got to talking to one another. So they knew, the Hungarians knew who the Czechs were, who the Slovaks were, and what they were doing. Surprisingly, a big fight could have broken out. The men had no weapons, though, so that probably saved them all. But as the Hungarian train is leaving the station, somebody hears I guess a Hungarian curse word from the car, and a big chunk of metal comes flying out of the train, hits one of the Czechs, and by all reports, kills him. I could not quite 100% confirm that he was killed, but most reports say he was killed. At least he looked like he died, because he just, went down. The Czechs ran after the train and stopped it. Fist fights were breaking out. There was a lot of anger. Anyway, the culprit was pointed out to the Czechs by his comrades. And he was just immediately murdered, lynched. In the context of war, that didn't seem too amazing to anybody. We would call it a war crime today, I guess, but in the context of that time and place, it didn't seem like a big deal. At that point, the Czechs just thought it was over. It was a fight. It was over. 2 people died. But the local communist authorities in Chelyabinsk decided that they had to involve themselves in this. So they called everybody into town, and they promptly arrested the Czechs and let the Hungarians go. And then the next day, a bunch of Czech soldiers are sent into town to find out what's going on, and they're arrested. This was the point, it wasn't the point of no return, but this was the point where the legionnaires gathered all the weapons they had. They marched 3 miles into town, and they freed their comrades from the jail. There was some shooting. None of the Reds, none of the Russians were killed. Reports are that maybe 2 or 3 Czechs were wounded or killed, but it was all over pretty quickly. They emptied the armory of the city to engage in this fight, which they always did. They always showed up, stole the other guy's weapons, fought him, and then oftentimes returned the weapons. And then they talked to the Red leader, the Soviet leader of Chelyabinsk. They talked to him. They didn't kill him. They didn't do anything to him. They tried to explain that they weren't there to overtake Chelyabinsk. They weren't there to overtake Russia. They just wanted to get their guys and go, leave. And he was okay with that. He really had no choice, but he was okay with it. And then they marched out of town singing, and they thought they were going to continue their journey to Vladivostok. In Moscow, Red Army leader Leon Trotsky hears this, and he writes later that he's, everything's going to hell in a handbasket, and he's kind of paranoid, and nothing's working. He has no army, and the country's still falling apart. But he loses his cool completely. He just loses his cool, and he really starts this. He starts the fight. He starts telegraphing dire threats on May 25th, which is probably so 11 days later, that his own soldiers would kill any armed legionnaire on sight. So if you're standing, minding your own business with a rifle in your hand, you're dead. And all the rest would go into labor camps. And he issued a number of these telegrams, but what he failed to appreciate was that the legionnaires decided to take over the train station. Well, in Siberia, the telegraph line follows the Trans-Siberian station. And so the telegraph operator, maybe there's 2 of them at best, but they were surrounded by legionnaires who said, we're in control here, we're in charge. So Trotsky thought he was sending telegrams to the Soviets in Chelyabinsk. He was sending them to the legionnaires themselves. They were reading these telegrams going, oh. So they knew what was coming. They weren't surprised. They had a meeting, and they got emotional, and they felt scared. Most of the men still had no weapons. I think the rule was maybe like 10 rifles for every 100 men. So it's not great. So they were scared, and they also knew, and I should have said this earlier, how they were spread out all across Siberia. They weren't in one place. They were, at the time in May of 1918, when this fight breaks out, there's about 8,000 guys who are still in European Russia around Penza, which is on the other side of the Urals. There's another 8,800 in Chelyabinsk in the vicinity. There's about 15,000 somewhere further east, but short of Irkutsk and Lake Baikal. And then there's the first 15,000 that actually got to Vladivostok, but hadn't heard anything about anybody coming back. Like they all got there and turned around and nobody was coming. Nobody was coming. So they're spread out, and so that looks frightening to Trotsky, that all these guys are spread out across this country. But look at it from their perspective. There's big gaps in between them. So if you're 8,000 guys at Chelyabinsk, you think you might face 50,000, 100,000 Russian soldiers any minute now. So they get pretty scared. But they decide to fight, and they fight really well. At this point, the Legion is about 50,000 troops who signed up for Masaryk's big plan. The rebels fought and defeated virtually every Red Army unit it encountered. In less than 4 months, they seized the entire Trans-Siberian, and with it all of Siberia, from the Ural Mountains to the Sea of Japan, a distance which equals that between Honolulu and New York, if you picture it. It's 5 million square miles. It's 1/10 of the world's land surface. And because the Trans-Siberian, the rail line and the telegraph line, is almost the only sign of civilization between the Urals and the Pacific, if you control that, you control it all. There's nothing else really. There's no roads to speak of. And while this was astonishing, those who had come to know these men before the outbreak of the violence, they were less surprised. The British writer Somerset Maugham, who wrote spy novels, some of the first spy novels actually, during this time he was hired by his government, the British government, to work as a kind of a spy in Russia. Spy sounds nefarious, but what he was really sent to do was to somehow get rid of the Bolsheviks, all by himself. He was just sent there with money and do something. Who are these people? Get rid of them somehow. Of course he couldn't. But he got to know the Czechs and Slovaks. He got to meet them. And he wrote that they, quote, "They are organized like a department store, disciplined like a Prussian regiment." He had a great deal of respect for them. After the fighting breaks out, roughly 15,000 more Czechs and Slovaks in the POW camps join the Legion. Now they see their comrades fighting, that this is real now. In part, I guess they want to protect their comrades, their fellow Czechs and Slovaks, but also I think they see, we might be able to do this. If we can take over Siberia, maybe we can get this country of ours. This leads Trotsky and Lenin to speak openly of the threat the men posed to Soviet rule. They really did. In a brief moment of time, for maybe 2-3 months, had they wanted to do so, and had they been supported by the Allies to do so, they quite literally could have rolled into Moscow and ended the experiment.
Glad they didn't.
Yeah. Speaking to an extraordinary joint session of Soviet leaders on July 28th, Lenin urged upon them the necessity of, quote, crushing the Czechoslovaks and their counter-revolutionary partisans on the Volga and the Urals in Siberia. This is the most urgent task of the Russian Revolution, and all other tasks must be relegated to background for the present, end quote. To the same group the next day, Trotsky conceded, quote, what is now happening on the Volga, in the shape of the Czechoslovak mutiny, puts Soviet Russia in danger, and therefore also endangers the international revolution. At first sight, it seems incomprehensible that some Czechoslovak corps, which has found itself here in Russia through the torturous ways of the World War, should at the given moment prove to be almost the chief factor in deciding the question of the Russian Revolution. Nevertheless, that is the case. The communists would often admit to things that were just remarkable failures on their part. They were sometimes occasionally honest about things. So the Legionnaires had it in their power to take out the Russians, the Soviet regime. They chose not to. They weren't. That wasn't their goal. And this becomes important later when Soviet history implies something different. That they were always anti-communist. That they were there to interfere in Russia. That they had an agenda. They had an agenda, but the agenda was always to get out, to leave. But this is a cautionary tale, and their activities in fighting the Red forces throughout the summer of 1918 had many unintended consequences. One of them was that when they advanced against Red Army forces toward the city where the Romanov family was held in July 1918, that directly precipitated Lenin's order to murder Tsar Nicholas II and his family. Lenin was concerned that the Tsar could be liberated and maybe turned into a symbol. In fact, through all my research, you could find almost no person on the planet, Russians included, who wanted the Tsar back on the throne. Even his own family thought he had failed miserably as a ruler. But still, inadvertently, when they came into the city a few days later, they learned that the Tsar and his family had been murdered in this cellar and their bodies taken away. At the time that they were attacking the city, they didn't know that the Tsar was there. The Legion also hastened the development of the Soviet Gulag with the founding of Russia's very first concentration camps. Historian Richard Pipes talks about, says, quote, "Talk of concentration camps was first heard in Soviet Russia in the spring of 1918 in connection with the Czech uprising." He does say that the Soviets would always have founded concentration camps eventually. I mean, that was going to be the nature of their rule. But it just so happens that it emerges around the Czech-Slovak revolt that they are in fact founded. Trotsky himself linked the establishment of concentration camps in Russia, Soviet Russia, and the Czecho-Slovak rebellion. I don't want to put just the quotes on that. He just said many, many times that he was creating the first concentration camps, basically to in turn disarm Czechs and Slovaks. The Legion also spurred the early buildup and configuration of the very Soviet Red Army it was fighting. Now, the Red Army was officially created by a decree in January 1918. Lenin was great at that. He would just issue decrees in a very, big way, big flurries. But there was no army. There just was no Red Army. There was no Russian army in Soviet Russia until the Czechs and Slovaks start fighting. And then it's turned over to Trotsky to create this army. And it's brutal how they do it. They just go into villages and grab the young men and drag them off. And when they desert, they shoot them. The desertion rate in the Red Army was very high. Of course, it had also been high in the Tsarist Russian army, and it had also been pretty high in the French army in the Western Front. The war was a horrible thing, and many people deserted. But Trotsky showed a kind of ruthless energy and skill, a real determination, and he created this Red Army in the summer of 1918 to fight the Czechoslovaks, number one. It says here that, quote, this is Trotsky, "Those who do not voluntarily hand over their arms, they'll be shot on the spot in accordance with my previous order." Echelons mean groups of Czechs and Slovaks which have been forcibly disarmed but could be confined in concentration camps. About the Red Army, Trotsky says, quote, "We are now forging on the anvil of war an army of first-class quality. It can be said that if the Czechoslovaks had not existed, they would have had to be invented. For under peacetime conditions, we should never have succeeded in forming, within a short time, a close-knit, disciplined, heroic army. But now this army is being formed before our eyes." And Richard Pipes says, it was the, quote, "It was the Czechoslovak rebellion that finally forced the Bolsheviks to tackle the formation of an army in earnest." And of course, the last unintended consequence was that this rebellion gave direct impetus to a very confused and ill-fated landing on Russian soil of U.S. troops for the first time, hopefully the last, in the infamous Allied intervention. Not many people appreciate that President Wilson dispatched U.S. soldiers to Russia explicitly to aid the Czechs and Slovaks. And then he wrote a lot of other things that were really incoherent and made that mission even more complicated. But the only specific role for U.S. troops in Russia was to, in effect, rescue the Czechs and Slovaks. What's a little funny about this is that by the time the U.S. Army and their General Graves, he doesn't arrive in Russia until September 1. Ironically, on September 1, the Czechs and Slovaks had finally reunited themselves all along the line at a place south of Chita, which is east of Lake Baikal. they finally linked up. They finally were one army from the Urals to the Pacific. And so what that meant was that they didn't need the US soldiers to rescue them. So when Graves arrives, he learns about this, and then he literally sits on his hands for 2, 3, the whole time he was in Russia, because he had that order. And Wilson said, you will do nothing else but rescue the Czechs and Slovaks. But they already rescued themselves. And then it got very complicated. But more importantly, and more intentionally, the Legion's willingness to fight for the Allies did indeed undermine the ancient Habsburg dynasty, which ruled one of Europe's most powerful countries, and did enable Masaryk and his key associates, Edward Beneš and Milan Stefanik, to establish the Republic of Czechoslovakia. And while the legionnaires themselves were trapped in Siberia by a shortage of ships for many more winters, and some of this is brutally outlined in the book, it's just shameful how they were treated. They did eventually return to Prague and Bratislava, welcomed as heroes. Winston Churchill said, quote, "The pages of history recall scarcely any parallel episode, at once so romantic in character and so extensive in scale." That quote kept me going for 23 years because I thought, Churchill's not easy to impress. He's kind of an impressive guy. And that quote kept me going for a long time because I thought, well, if that's true, then somebody should write the damn book. The prime minister he served, Prime Minister David Lloyd George, he and Churchill didn't get along at all, but they agreed about the Czechs and Slovaks. Lord George wrote to Masaryk on September 11, 1918 to say, quote, "The story of the adventures and triumphs of this small army is indeed one of the great epics of history." Former US President Teddy Roosevelt, long out of office, grieving over the death of his own son in the war, was nonetheless inspired by reports of the Legion's achievements in Russia. He donated $1,000 of the cash award he had received many years earlier for his 1906 Nobel Peace Prize to the Legionnaires. And, quote, he said, "The extraordinary nature of whose great and heroic feat is literally unparalleled, as far as I know, in ancient or modern warfare." Roosevelt's mortal enemy, Woodrow Wilson, also agreed, and Wilson eventually welcomed a group of the Legionnaires to the White House as they made their way home. And of course, especially for this audience, this story has links to Pennsylvania and to Pittsburgh and to Cleveland. You know about all that. I have to say that I still admire Masaryk a lot as a person and a leader. But what happened with the Pittsburgh Agreement was, I heard about this early on in my research and thought, well, politics, people disagree, everyone disagrees, yada, yada, yada. But, he signed the Pittsburgh Agreement twice in this country. Once in New York, right before he boarded his ship to return to Europe. Earlier, he signed it in Pittsburgh. And it was explicit and clear and plain. It wasn't real vague. It wasn't a long document. And the demands that the Czechs, the Slovaks wanted were what we would classify as under the heading of autonomy, meaning they wanted Slovaks taught in their schools. They wanted provisions like that would make them feel that there was a Slovak subunit of this new country called Czechoslovakia. From today's perspective, and maybe that's not the right perspective, but today's perspective, that doesn't seem like they were asking for a lot. It seems like Slovak autonomy would have been entirely plausible and possible without threatening the new Czechoslovak state. Principally because the Slovaks had no other options at the time, or they would have perceived it that way. They would not have perceived an ability on their own to create their own country. That's part of the reason they joined with the Czechs in this new country. And for that, I think initially they were actually grateful. I think the early years were happy years, like in a lot of relationships. But as time went on, they fully expected these provisions to be met, and they were not. And I sort of surmised that Masaryk and his associates really feared the Germans, the Germans inside Czechoslovakia. They saw, I think the numbers are in the book. I forget what they are, but I think there might be 9 million Czechs, and then there's maybe 2 million Slovaks, but there's 3 or or more million Germans. And the math of that situation scared Prague, I think. And it was, and of course, when you think about the fact that you just deposed this Austrian regime, which hasn't really, it's gone away, but the people are still around. And then to the north of you is the bigger German regime. And then you had 3 million Germans literally surrounding your country inside the borders. The fear was quite understandable. But I think with time, Slovak autonomy could have been granted without threatening the Czech-Slovak state. Maastricht himself said we need, I think what he said, we need 50 years or so, I forget what the exact number was. He said we need time to build this country. And he got, instead of getting 50 years, he got 20 when it was destroyed in 1938. History and its bastard stepchild, war, are full of surprises, which is why students of both should become familiar with this forgotten conflict, whose unwilling participants were both egregiously victimized and defiantly aggressive, motivated equally by fear, revenge, and ambition. At various times, the legionnaires succumbed to desertion, imprisonment, betrayal, death, fratricide, suicide, despair, and mutiny. They fought on 3 sides of 2 wars, World War I and the Russian Civil War, that ended with the destruction of all 3 of the regimes they served: Austria-Hungary, Russia's Tsarist regime, some of them had fought for the Tsar, and the Russian Provisional Government. Despite all of this, they emerged victorious. Who knew? And that concludes my prepared remarks. I would really encourage any questions you might have. Yes, sir.
You don't mention anything about the whites. Are there reds and whites?
Oh, yes.
General code chart.
Yes. That's covered in the book.
So that's one thing. And the other one is if you have a large army, you need logistics, food, and things like that. How did they handle that?
They, well, in the context... Yes.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, sure.
Not everybody.
Yeah, the question was, I didn't mention in my remarks the white Russian forces, the role they played in the Civil War, and of course they had a relationship with the Czech, the legionnaires, a very bumpy relationship, and of course, and then asked about how did they provision themselves, how did the legionnaires provision themselves. In the chaos of Russia, Russia was a destroyed country even by 1916 in every way. The army was melting away, disappearing. There was no food, there was no fuel. So initially, the greatest store of weapons that the Czechs and Slovaks gathered together occurred when, just as they began in Ukraine to get permission to start this journey, the Germans keep invading. The Germans keep invading Russia. The Germans signed an agreement with Soviet Russia not to invade them, and 2 days later invaded them. I mean, the Germans were as ruthless as the Bolsheviks were. Everyone lied about everything. Everyone was just completely ruthless and completely insincere. So the Czechs and Slovaks literally have to run from the Germans, soldiers who are advancing as they always did, really fast, and nobody can beat them, ever, anywhere, except after the Americans came in. So the Germans are sweeping into Russia, and the Czechs and Slovaks know, among other things, I mean, aside from getting shot today, if we get captured, these are the allies of the Austria-Hungary. So if we get captured, then we get executed. So they start to flee. Well, the Russian units that were still in existence in Ukraine just ran. They just fled. And they left behind artillery, lots of weapons, trains. And so the first trains and most of the trains that they ever got, they just took in those few weeks or months, and they took them as they fled for their lives out of Ukraine through Kiev and running the other way. They actually got their hands on an airplane, I think, at least one airplane. They had some armored cars. They took everything, but they took it from the Russians mostly. And of course, there was a semi-independent Ukrainian government that they had some weapons. They took those too. They were authorized to buy anything. By this time, they had French money. They were authorized to buy things, but in the context of that 4 or 5 week episode, they just took everything. The French money later provided for food, and so they could buy food. They also were very industrious. everyone said about them that they just seemed to be a special kind of people. And part of what I hope that people get out of this book is that, you know, the Czech-Slovaks have had a bumpy history and a lot of disappointments, but you know, they have it within themselves to be really, you know, creative and courageous and powerful. They had their own printing press. They had more than one newspaper. I mean, one newspaper for the Legion wasn't enough. They had like 2 or 3 different newspapers just to inform everybody. They had tailors, and they had a whole city on the trains of things they did for themselves. But they did get, at least initially, a loan of 15 million francs, I guess, from the French government. That's how they provisioned themselves. About the whites. So the Allied intervention in Russia is incredibly confusing. It's a very disappointing topic to read about. It's very complex. It's just like chaotic. The many parties that were involved. Japan had occupied the Russian Far East, and they were probably the most powerful force. There was these Americans who were walking around waiting for something to do and not doing much of anything, but people were a little bit wary of them. Then there were the Czechs and the Slovaks, and then the white forces. The whites were too many officers, too few men, too many soldiers willing to tell other soldiers what to do, but too few willing to die. You know, there was just too many guys sitting around tables in safe cities directing someone else to fight this war, and it turned out that the Czechs and Slovaks initially were fighting the war for them. The white movement was divided, and eventually, and from the very, you should know this, that from the very first, when Kolchak, there was an Admiral Kolchak, who was appointed the one white leader at one point. They finally agreed that he would be the white leader. It's hilarious that they're fighting a war in the middle of Siberia, and they pick an admiral. But he is not a bad man, but he's not fit for this job. The whites are not organized. And the Czechs and Slovaks went on record explicitly and emotionally that when he finally seized power, calling himself the supreme ruler of Russia, they almost stopped fighting right away. So many years later, the Czechs and Slovaks are made to look like they're inside Russia fighting the Soviets on behalf of the whites somehow. And there's nothing further from the truth. When I first proposed this book project to people and I needed some help, I went to Richard Pipes at Harvard. I know his son. And he wrote this letter. He says, you know, it's a good project, and there's a blurb somewhere. He said something nice, but then he said the rest of his letter was, you know, those Czechs and Slovaks were horrible. They turned over Kolchak at Irkutsk. They turned him over to the Soviets. Horrible, horrible, horrible thing. Well, when you finally look into the research and look into it, it's amazing they didn't just walk up behind him and shoot him. They had nothing in common. At the very end, Kolchak, before he is taken prisoner, is actually organizing forces to fight, to kill Czechs and Slovaks. I mean, they're fighting each other at this point. So the fact that they turned him over in order for them to finally get the heck out, not only is not surprising, but I thought was overdue and probably a nice, sort of a kind gesture. Well, they knew what was going to happen to him. He was turned over at Irkutsk station on January 20th, 1919, and he was executed the next month at a local prison to the wails of his mistress in the prison cell. Yeah, so the white force, it's a very complex, the Allied intervention, there's many books written about it, it's very complex, but the role of the Czechs and the Slovaks, they did fight the Red Army. In a sense, they were anti-Soviet, but only because they were defending themselves. What they really wanted to do was get out. And that's what gets lost in other histories. It's made to seem that somehow Czechs and Slovaks show up in Siberia somehow, and they want to fight, you know, Russians, and you're wondering why, you know. And then they just disappear from the story. That's what irritated me about other histories. When you get to know the men, and you read their letters, and you understand what they want and what they've been doing, you find out that they're not anti-communist. In fact, there's a page or two about how most of the Czechs and Slovaks were undoubtedly socialists. And Masaryk and Beneš were socialists. And Masaryk's wife was a socialist. They were all members of the Social Democratic Party in Europe, which was the most popular party. And you might not know this, but the Bolsheviks in Russia emerged from the Russian Social Democratic Party. So everybody who's a member of that party is fairly a socialist. I mean, back then, it wasn't considered much of a bad thing. It was like being a liberal. It was like being a modern person. So you were a socialist if you were modern. And they were all socialists. So the idea that they were right-wingers, somehow that idea took hold. It's just not true. Yes?
question. You haven't mentioned it much, but can you tell us a little bit about the involvement of Milan Rastislav Štefanik in this?
Yeah, it was tragic. As many of you might know, there was really three leaders of the Czech-Slovak Legion on the global scale, politically. Only one was Slovak, Milan Štefanik. He was an unusual person, and just at the moment of their greatest victory, when it's all been settled, that the country's founded, he's flying from, I forget where, but he's flying into Bratislava. And his plane with a couple of Italians, he's coming from Italy, maybe from Rome, and the plane just crashes right in Bratislava. And that's in part why the airport there is named for him today. So he was the one Slovak with two other Czechs. He and Beneš did not get along. Near the end of his life, they were already fighting, which is sort of an omen for what happens later. Beneš, I get the sense from all of it that Beneš was Masaryek's number 2, and there wasn't going to be a number 3. That kind of thing. He did not want to. Beneš was not a magnanimous guy. He didn't have that kind of personality. A little insecure, a little cold. A very good, able administrator, but not a good politician. So Beneš is really pushing Stefanik almost out of the government. That from the minute he's in the government, he never, Stefanik never makes it back to Prague or Bratislava to join the government that he'd been appointed to. And the plane crashed. But even before he gets, even before his plane gets into the air, he's being pushed to the back. So the fight with the Slovaks would have come harder, faster, and sooner had he lived. And it seems a little unfortunate. I've read, from what I've gathered, I think even Masaryk was a little bit condescending in some of his remarks and things about Stefanik. Because after all, you can't, when these guys were going around Europe saying we're Czechoslovaks and Czechoslovaks are one people, and we represent them, by the way, 2 guys, there was 2 Czechs, there was no Slovaks. So this is why Masaryk comes to America. He's looking for Slovaks. And basically he's like, any Slovaks here? Somebody raises their hand, and he starts negotiating with American Slovaks. That's it shows his skill, it shows his determination. It's sort of admirable on one hand, but it's bizarre on the other hand that the Czechs and Slovaks come together as one people in a new country because American Slovaks thought it was a good idea. I mean, it's almost outrageous, but it's also clever. But it's looking back on it, you think if would Syrian Americans who've been here for many generations, do they get to vote on what Syria looks like in the future? Of course not. But the American Slovaks did. But that was because Tomáš had no other Slovaks. He couldn't get back into Slovakia. With the war going on, Hungary would not allow anything like that to happen. So he had no Slovaks except for Milan. So they needed him. I guess that's my point. They needed him, and they didn't treat him very well. Yes.
Okay, just a comment. One comment, I did get a chance to read your book, and I thought it was interesting that you mentioned or referred to the Kurds earlier. Because when you're reading the book, obviously it's a very complex situation there in Russia with all the different factions, with the Legion constantly flipping around, And so that's what I had, the impression that I had in reading the book, and I'd recommend to everyone. If you really read this book, you get a much better appreciation of what's going on in the Middle East and in Syria today.
Yeah,
because of the complexity, but you don't know which faction was who, and it was changing.
Right.
So that's just a comment that I thought. But I did want you to mention, I think that the crowd might be interested in the Russian gold. Now, what I recall is they came into possession of the Russian gold. Was that through the whites?
No, they
and then they traded it.
Yes, they did. So at one point, when the Germans are pressing down on St. Petersburg and Moscow, effectively, the Bolsheviks take roughly half of the whole Imperial gold reserve, trainloads of gold, and they move it to Kazan.
What, sorry?
Kazan. It's a city on the I think along the Volga in the interior of Russia to protect the gold from the Germans, who would have gladly taken it. And it's when the Czechs and Slovaks take that city that they learn about the gold. And I think they took it mostly as sort of to protect themselves. Because if they had the gold, someone would have to talk to them at some point rather than just shoot them. That's the way I look at it. Because they gave it back eventually. They didn't really need money. They didn't strike me as a group, they were disciplined. So it wasn't like looting. There wasn't any looting or any of that kind of stuff. So I think they took the gold just for safety, just precaution, insurance policy, yeah. So they take it, and then of course they, and then at some point they give it to Kolchak to show that they're not there to pillage. So they give it to Kolchak, and then in the Great Retreat, as the Red Army finally masses and is just hitting them, and they're retreating in this horrible retreat through the winter of 1819, 18 and 19. It's a little confusing because Kolchak is basically cashiered by the Allies, but no one knows who's in charge. The Czechs and Slovaks have had enough of him, and they're going to protect themselves. You know, they're tired of this, and they're going to go. But at some point, everything comes together in Irkutsk, where the Czechs and Slovaks could keep killing and dying in order to get out. But they thought, well, why do we do this? Well, by this time, there's already a Czech-Slovak republic in Europe. So all the men are thinking, why are we here? I mean, this is, you know. So, and why would I die? And why would I shoot somebody? Why would I do any of this? So they do a deal in Irkutsk. They turn over the gold and Kolchak to the Soviet authorities there, and they're allowed to proceed onto Vladivostok, and they're unmolested for the rest of their time in Russia, except that the Allies somehow forget about them completely, and they just spend an ungodly amount of time. There's a quote in the book from a U.S. State Department person. I think Wilson by this time had fired Secretary of State Landsey. I think Wilson might have had a stroke at this point and was incapacitated somehow. But the number 2 State Department person at one point, after failing to provide the ships to move these men, and they don't necessarily have food. What you said earlier, they do have food most of the time. But you can't take it for granted they can feed themselves here. He actually threatens them at one point. Finally, a ship shows up, and he sends a threatening telegram telling the Czechs and Slovaks, some of whom are still in Irkutsk, which is maybe 2,000 miles away, that if they don't hurry up and get on this ship by a date certain, June 10th, that the ship's leaving without them. Really astonishing levels of just coldness, astonishing levels of arrogance. I like to think it was based on misinformation or a lack of understanding about what was going on. But yeah, they were not treated very well, but it took a while to get all the votes.
What about resources? I mean, how much time did you spend in archives and libraries and the countries, places where?
I'll confess, I've never been to the Czech-Slovak republics. Not once, not in my life. What I did, the way I wrote this book was that, no, well, yes, I was in Siberia I traveled across Siberia in 1993. And it was right after the Soviet Union imploded, and people wanted to see Siberia, wanted to see Russia. So I was sent as a sort of not a guide, but basically my former employer stuffed my pockets with either $8,000 or $10,000 in cash because in case anything happened. So I had all this cash and kind of, I recall $100 bills, I don't know, wads and wads of cash. In case somebody got sick or something, I don't know. I wasn't given very many instructions, but so we went across about 2,000 miles of Siberia, and this is when I first learned about the Legion. But in the briefing documents, it said simply that, you know, a little history in Siberia at the end of the First World War, this army marched back and forth, and I thought, well, that's an amazing story. So when I get back to the States, I'll buy the book. When I get back to the States, really there wasn't much in the way of any books. There's maybe 3 or 4 histories written in English. I don't know Russian. They were all out of print. I didn't like the books much. There was one by a memoir published in London by a guy named Bedford, I think. Not bad. He was there for lots of the things. He wrote a decent memoir. But anyway, so what happened was I kept struggling with how do I write this book. I don't have many credentials. I don't, you know, how can I write the book, in other words? I want it to be written, but how would I write it? And a colleague of mine at Drexel one day sent me an email. This is like almost 10 years later. And he says, look at this. Now, email's been invented in the time. eBay has been discovered or created. And he sent me a link to eBay. And he says, on eBay, there's a guy either in Sweden or Switzerland who has these 5 volumes of first-hand accounts by the Czechs and Slovaks that they, I think, told to transcribers when they get back to Prague. I think the way it reads is like, they were sat down and told, tell me your most interesting story about this experience you had. And they tell these first-person stories. And they're very idiosyncratic. They're sort of all over the map. But it's great raw material. There were between 400 and 500 stories. I think only like 120 authors, so many of the guys told multiple stories. But it covered the whole story. So I had that translated. I raised 3 foundation grants or fellowships. I raised $46,000, $48,000. That took a while.
available somewhere?
Yeah, they're old. I'm going to mangle the title in Czech. It's in the book. It's in the bibliography. They were published in Prague in the 1920s over many years. They're big, they're fat. I still have the set in my study, and they have a lot of pictures too, black and white pictures. So I had those translated. I hired a translator. That took money. That took time. Uncle Sam punished me by taxing. I had to pay a tax bill on one of the foundation grants. I gave all the money to the translator, and then I got stuck with the bill for the tax. That's okay. Anyway, so he translated all these, and that's what I brought to the story. These documents, the first-hand accounts, and the men were, quite clear and illuminating. And I especially looked for times and places where something that one of these men said here in his little story in Prague in the 1920s is corresponded by something out here, like a scholar discovered in the archives. I looked for those things. I was very, people have bad memories. People sometimes exaggerate. So I was very careful about using the material, but it was very reliable and very interesting. And it tells you what they were thinking. People, I admire Richard Pipes, probably the preeminent historian of Russia in our country, but a little bit of that arrogance of like treating the Czechs and Slovaks like they were a pawn, and the pawn didn't make the right move, at the right time. Like it should have done this, it should have done that. But if you know what the men are going through, it's like, come on. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. I'm curious, with the writing process, when you were putting this puzzle together to tell the story, what was the most surprising part? Because if you had the pieces, you had the archives, then you're trying to figure out how do I put this together to make sure it's a story that tells the main parts, but at the same time there are probably many surprises when you start drafting it.
Yeah, it's a big project. I vow never to write a book so intricate again. I would love to write a book about one American who speaks only English and had a short life, and I'll just write his biography. My principal fear was that I would miss something, like just completely miss something, or obviously get something wrong. So I spent those 23 years writing it. I spent 23 years on this. I read everything. And when I read everything, I was convinced that something out there was that I didn't see it, and I wanted to get it. And I just, so my study is still full of papers and books and documents my wife would love me to throw away. So it was difficult, let me just say that. I will say that the manuscript, when I signed off with the publisher, I've never signed a book contract, so he said 125,000 words. And I didn't know if that was a floor, a minimum, or a ceiling. But because I had no idea how I was going to do this, I just didn't even bother talking about it. Well, it turns out it's a ceiling. When I finally finished the book, I had 177,000 words. And it was brutal. It was like they took a machine gun to my manuscript and just destroyed it because they only wanted to publish a book of 125,000 words. So I had to fight and wrangle to get about, I want to say 5,000 or 6,000 words back in. By the way, Milan Stefanik, completely out of the book. He's missing from the book.
I just wanted to, one quick note, like actually, when I was little, my grandmother, she had a book, hopefully she still has it. It's actually a history of, and I don't remember, it might be like a unit of this legion, and they were named by M.R. Stefanik. So it was a history of this one unit with a lot of pictures.
Oh yeah. One of the units took his name. Yeah.
Okay, so that was one book about this one unit, I guess. So that's where I heard first time about it, and I saw pictures of him being there.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's all mentioned, and also
it is.
I saw like in press, it's by Wall Street Journal, for example. It says memoirs of the gallant man who served in the rejuvenated Czech Legion during. So it's like kind of like. Many times mentioned Czech, and it's not really mentioned like Milan Rastislav Stefanik, who was a French general, was involved, and so it's kind of surprising.
No, the 5,000 or 6,000 words that I put back in were about him and about other things. When an editor edits your manuscript, they don't do it like a surgeon. They kind of just take a jackhammer to it. So I had to read my entire book over again and ask myself, is anything missing here that has to get back in? And then one night in a hot panic, I went, oh my God, Stefanik's not even here anymore. He's not even in the book. So, and I had arguments with the publisher. You know, we had to put words back in. So he's in there, and his story is told, I think, fairly. Again, there were 22,000 words that didn't make it. What I hope to do one day is, I have a website and an email thing that I do, Gmail or whatever it's called, monkey something. Well, I send out emails once in a while, not too many. If you all want to give me your email address, I can. But what I plan to do in the future is to take sections of the book that didn't make it, and that are coherent, say something, and just send them out to people. You know, just send out chunks of the story that didn't make it in the book. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, just, I'm trying to remember my European history. At the beginning, during the war, these gentlemen were conscripted, I guess, by the Austro-Hungarian
Yes, everybody was drafted for that war, yeah.
to fight against Russia
And
on
so,
the side of the Germans.
yes.
And that's where they got taken prisoner.
Yeah, the way the war broke down was the Germans were always in control. It's a rule of nature. The Germans always had to be in control of everything. But the Germans fought the French and the British over here and preferred and hoped that Austria-Hungary could hold off Russia and Serbia in the east. The Austro-Hungarian army lost every battle they fought without German support, every one. You recall that most of you know that the war was fought because Austria wanted to punish little Serbia. I think Serbia might be the size of Ohio.
Maybe.
Yeah. And so the whole real purpose of the war, there's no other justification except that the guys in Austria were hot to punish the little Serbians. Well, the war breaks out, and over the course of a year and a half, Austria-Hungary invades Serbia one time and loses. They invade a second time and they lose. They're being beaten by Serbia. And it took a third invasion with, I think, Bulgaria or Romania coming in behind the Serbs and stabbing them in the back. It takes, I think it's like 300,000 or 400,000 dead Austro-Hungarian soldiers in about 18 months to punish little Serbia. So anyway, so what happened in the war is that the Germans had to fight the French and the British over here. They also had to prop up the Austrians, but that might have saved the war in the West. Because if the Germans were free, they always beat the French and the British. Almost always. I mean, and holding those muddy lines was one thing, but that doesn't win the war. In other words, if you wake up the next day and you're still there, that's good, but you haven't won either. So there was no way the French and the British were going to win. And so it became just a slaughterhouse. Yes?
Did you in your research come across that besides Czechs and Slovak members of the Legion, there were other ethnic members and ethnic groups involved in this great adventure?
Yeah.
Let's say Poles, or did you come across any?
Yeah, there was a very brief Polish legion that might have had an aspiration like the Czechs and Slovaks, because the Poles hoped to come out of the war independent again also, which they did. Poland was divided in three by Austria, Russia, and Germany. Many years earlier, the Poles wanted their independence, some of them anyway. And there was a Polish legion.
Any ethnic Germans?
No, but one thing I did, my research uncovered, and it's in the book, and this surprised me a lot. The Soviets like to say, when all this was over, that all you foreigners, the British, the French, the Americans, the Japanese, you interfered in our revolution. You interfered. Well, it turns out that the Red Army managed to persuade that the Czechs and Slovaks were fighting for their independence. But of all the other POWs who were Austrian, ethnic Austrians, Hungarians, upwards, hundreds of thousands of them volunteered to fight for the Red Army. The initial Red Army attacking the Czechoslovaks, this is a complicating factor that wasn't appreciated outside. The initial attacks on them were not Russian communists. They were Austrians and Hungarians who were fighting for money, mostly. And this looks very different to a Czech or Slovak, than to be, they could come to an agreement with Russians, perhaps. But here it is, ironically, Austrian soldiers are fighting them inside Siberia. And that they were called the Internationalists. The Red Army had an internationalist wing. And it had hundreds and thousands of troops in it. By the way, about 10,000 Czechs and Slovaks joined up the Red Army.
That would be an interesting book also.
Yeah, 23 years.
I met one in Tashkent, son of somebody who got stuck there.
Yeah, yeah, the
Amazing,
son,
amazing.
some of the children of legionnaires are still alive, I've met a few of them. Yes, ma'am?
Yeah, the reason what maybe my husband asked if the Germans were involved. I came from the southern part of what is now was Czech-Slovakia, from Moravia. And as a kid, I remember grown-ups talking, our neighbor came home after 7 years after he was a prisoner of war. At that time, I really, as a kid, what did I care about it, you know? But then later I started to think, where was he locked up? Apparently they weren't locked up. He was on the road, you know, that he came home from Vladivostok.
Right.
And it so happened at that time, my husband and I, we had absolutely no connection because he grew up born here, but he grew up in the Pilsen area.
Yeah.
And his uncle was one of the men too involved in that long trip.
Yes, yeah. As I said at the beginning, there were about 2 million Austro-Hungarian POWs trapped in Russia. The Czechs and Slovaks go off on this big adventure, and they're fighting all across Siberia. But there are still, almost 2 million Hungarian and Austrian and the other ethnicities of Austro-Hungary, Polish troops who are still stuck in Siberia, in Russia. When the final evacuation takes place, the evacuated ships at Vladivostok actually took a few of these Austrians and Hungarians because at this point, things had been kind of settled. People were civilized, they were not fighting each other so much, so it was okay. But the vast majority of those Austrian and Hungarian and Polish and Slovenian, all those soldiers who were held as POWs in Russia, they were repatriated by train, by agreement. It took many years as well. But a fair number of them got tired of waiting. And there are stories, and I believe some of them are true, of guys who just said, I'm going to walk. Which is, I don't know, if that's 8,000 miles, or we're going to walk from Siberia to the heart of Europe, and they made it eventually, yeah. They just showed up one day. Yes.
I have a suggestion. I think you should ask or maybe the foundation here should ask the Czech and Slovak governments for you to go there.
I would love that.
And go to schools, and every day deliver a lecture like this, because it's completely unknown.
Yeah,
completely unknown.
That's sad. It is. It's a shame.
It's incredible. The communists managed to completely extinguish this part of Czech history from the books.
And it's a great story. I mean, it's a better story than our founding. Yes, sir.
I just want to follow up on what the gentleman just said. The Czech Republic has rebuilt the postal train that was used.
I know, I see it. I'm actually talking to people in the Czech Republic who are making a feature film about the Legion.
Right.
It's on the right.
And two of them came to Philadelphia last summer, and they showed me all these pictures. They have the calendar. They have a calendar. And
right.
They're trying to raise money for the film.
And the second part of this is there is a book to be published in December that will describe that the mail system that the Czechoslovaks utilized in Siberia.
Yeah, they had their own stamps.
It includes a lot of the history also.
Yeah, one of the sources I got, really obscure things, but there's a stamp group in York, Great Britain. Oh, is that you? And they wrote basically a postal history of the Czechoslovak Legion, and I have it, and I read it. Wasn't able to use it, but I did read it. Yes, ma'am.
We had another author here a couple of years ago or so. It was a woman, and she was describing the same story. And she mentioned about how along the train line, it went through a mountain, and the tunnel collapsed, and that's why nobody over there knew anything that was going on.
Oh yeah, yeah. In fact, I just finished on Friday an excerpt from the book about that. That's going to appear in the journal called Military History Quarterly. It's sort of a glossy magazine that goes out 4 times a year. So, and it's all about that. So there were 39 tunnels. This has changed since then, but at the time, if you wanted to take the Trans-Siberian from Europe to the Pacific Ocean, when you got to Lake Baikal, which is as big as Belgium, Lake Baikal holds 1/5 of the world's fresh water. Think about that, 1/5 of the globe's fresh water is in one lake. It's the surface is the size of Belgium, and the railroad came out of Irkutsk down the Angara River Valley, and then turned right, and then went along the coast of the lake, and there were 39 tunnels. The Legionnaires rolled into Irkutsk on July 11th, and July 12th they got wind of, when the Bolsheviks left town, they just ran out of that city. They took with them trainloads of dynamite. So the Legionnaires chased them in 3 columns, in 3 different directions, trying to get there first, and stop them from blowing up the tunnels. The fear was they'd be trapped. When they got to sort of the port, there's a little port, like here's the lake in front of us, right? They get to a port, and then they turn right, and these are the 39 tunnels that stretch out for miles. When they got to this place, they started fighting. There were Legionnaires on the cliffs, and I've been to this place. There was Legionnaires on the cliffs shooting down at the Bolsheviks, and they accidentally hit the dynamite. The explosion broke windows like for miles around. So the first tunnel was blown up by the Czech-Slovaks. But another Bolshevik train just took off, and they chased them. And again, the Bolsheviks blew up, the Red Army blew up another tunnel. It took the Czechs and the Slovaks 3 weeks to clear that. But at the same time, these guys were very good soldiers. While they're cleaning up this mess here, trying to go down this rail and go around the lake, they sent guys on boats, sort of made-up kind of boats, and sent them across the lake, which might take you a day. And then they caught these guys in a pincer movement. So while they finally got their trains through this way, there's a whole bunch of Czechs and Slovaks behind the enemy. They don't even know it. And they got them in a pincer movement. So the battle around Lake Baikal was the last big fight. And it was a few weeks later, on September 1st, as I said earlier, that the Czechs from Vladivostok coming this way met up with the Czechs and Slovaks coming this way. And they met up on September 1st. Yes, sir.
Okay, so you mentioned that they finally did get to Vladivostok, and then they took a while, and then they all went different places, and some went around, I guess, South America.
Yeah.
Now, some would have come through the U.S.
They
on a
did.
ship. So what, I mean, and I didn't discuss that too much in the book because it was towards the end.
Yeah, yeah.
Or your words got cut.
Yeah.
But, so did they have experiences in the United States? Did any of them settle in the United States?
It was amazing. They got, the whole evacuation was improvised. Nobody had any money, everything was broke. I forget who paid. I think the Americans and the British basically ended up paying for all the ships that would take them home. But they went by different routes. So if you have a world map in your head, so a lot of them go into the Pacific, down around Malaysia, up through India, through the Suez Canal, across the Mediterranean, and into some port, and they take trains north. But many of them went across the Pacific. Some stopped in Hawaii, which would have been a real treat. And they went to Vancouver, and they went to San Diego, at least those 2 cities, and then took trains across. And then some went through the Panama Canal and across the Atlantic, and then into the European ports. A bunch of them who went across the United States stopped in Washington, and on a rainy Washington day, they marched themselves in front of the White House. And Wilson was there, and he reviewed them, and then they were guests at the White House for a little while. There is circumstantial evidence that some of the guys might have slipped away and stayed here. And I know of one guy, he lives in Philadelphia, he's the son of a Legionnaire. His father came through the United States, saw relatives in Pittsburgh, and probably never saw the United States before. Went back home and tried to join the Czech-Slovak border guard. Now, he'd been a Legionnaire in Siberia for 6 years. He was told he wasn't qualified because he was too short. So he got mad. So he left and came back to this country, had a son, who's still alive, lives in Philadelphia. His son became the first trumpeter for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and then the first trumpeter for the Philadelphia Orchestra. He's still alive, Frank Catterback. He has a treasure trove of photographs. A nice man. I worked on him for a year. I tried to get him to give me the photos for the book. And he has them in an old-fashioned scrapbook, you know, where things are glued in, and he wouldn't let me pull them out. And yeah, so I couldn't get him to release those right there. Yes?
What piqued your interest in the subject matter? And also, what was the drive to keep you going over 20 years? I mean, you didn't get an advance in year one. If you got any advance.
No, this has cost me a little bit. No, it was a trip across Siberia, and I heard about this great story. I mean, I read a lot, and I think I can recognize a great story. But what often happens is that if you want to write a story, you find out that the book has already been written, and then you read the book and you think, that's a pretty good book, so why would I write it? But so this one, I could not find the book. And I kept going. If I had known it was going to take 23 years, I would have stopped in year one. I just didn't know. In many years, I was just reading. I wasn't doing anything. But, yes, sir.
Yeah, you're from Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. I was just wondering, most of the legionnaires that went to the west, that were on the Western Front, which is not as interesting as the Eastern, but most of them were basically Slovaks from Pittsburgh.
Yep.
Organized by Stefani.
Yes. Yes, he spent years here organizing Czechs and Slovaks in this country to volunteer for the French army. They were all
basically opened up doors for Masaryk.
Yes. Oh, yes. Stefanik got Masaryk his first meeting with the Premier of France, because he was a French naval officer and a kind of a bon vivant around Paris. Yeah, he did great service for the cause. It's just a tragedy how he was treated. But the Czechs and the Slovaks who volunteered for the French, it's sad. Not that it was more sad necessarily, because the British and French were dying too, but there was at least an entire regiment of Czechs and Slovaks that went to the Western Front and never came back. No. So the unit was just disbanded. Yes, sir.
Two questions. Of all the legionnaires that traveled on the Siberian Railway, what percent or what number came back? The second question is that you were talking about the cohesiveness of the Czech and Slovak units that were captive in the years of war camp. Is that partially because of the split of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Austrians being more organized for their soldiers and better grade soldiers?
You know, there's a couple of reasons. One is they were motivated. The nationalism of the Czechs, especially, in this sense, the Czechs were different from the Slovaks. The Czechs had a nationalist cause that they pushed for hundreds of years. And the Battle of White Mountain, all that. So they weren't going to let it go, number one. The Slovaks were a little bit more like, where are we here? Where am I? You know, the Slovaks were not oppressed by the Germans. So when the Czechs would complain over here about Austrian German rule and those evil Habsburgs, the Slovaks would go, well, we have the Hungarians, you know. So there was a difference in that. But the Bohemia and Moravia were the industrial heartland of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's where the money came from. And industry is, you know, kind of a new thing in the 1800s, but by 1914, everybody knows what a factory is and what a train is and a telegraph and how these are important things to have. And if you looked at Austria-Hungary, all you would see is farmland, except for Bohemia and Moravia, where the mines were and the factories. So that would account for organization. The Russian army was composed of illiterate peasant serfs from the prairies. The Czechs and Slovaks were not entirely, but by and large, they were either factory people or town people, what you would call town people. Back at a time when, if you lived in a town, had a job in a town, you were cut above all those farmers, right? So that would account for a lot of it, I think. Yes, sir.
Do we have time for another question or two? So,
One of the things that maybe most people miss this, but the Masaryk's father was a coachman, and he was a Slovak.
Yes.
So of course, but fortunately, knowing that he was not very literate, he had a Moravian wife, which was also very good, because she was a real doer. And he really sort of wanted his son to study. So he went through a number of universities, including German university, and ended up in Charles University in Prague, so that he became a Czech by settlement.
Yeah.
And the thing was that in that first period when a lot of Czechs and Slovaks went to France or studied in Germany, or like my father did Hungary, Germany, France. You connected up with all these other people, and that's where this fervor about Czechoslovak issues came up.
Right, yeah, Maastricht says that he kind of discovered that he was Czech somehow when he was in Vienna.
Yeah.
Because he's at the University of Vienna, and these Austrian Germans look down at anybody who has a different kind of accent. And he met a few other Czech students, and suddenly his eyes were opened a little bit that this is us and that's them.
Yeah, and he was one of the first Czechoslovaks, who was a member of the Austrian Parliament.
Yes.
Among the other things, where he in fact defended a Gavrilović, who was a Serbian, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so that also led into Sarajevo and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But the early followers of Masaryk and Stefani had gone through France, and Masaryk's wife was Gary, an American, who brought to him the knowledge of American Constitution,
Mm-hmm.
Bill of Rights, all these things. So that was where she was sort of a liberal, really.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting that Czechoslovakia had female voting rights before we did in the United States.
That's right. And I'll just say one thing about that. It's ironic that Maastricht had in his DNA
That's right.
a Slovak piece and a Moravian piece. And Beneš was from the Czech part.
That's right.
And then they had Stefanik. They had within their very DNA all the parts they needed. They just needed to give the Slovaks, to be more tolerant and magnanimous and cooperative. It would have worked. Teaching some kids in Slovak over here and some kids in Czech over here would not have torn Czechoslovakia apart.
No.
But,
One
And
last
it
question.
didn't because they were fluent, bilingual. You go to there and you are bilingual automatically.